Hello again. I hope this video finds you well and that you had at least something of an Easter break during the last week. Obviously you weren't able to do anything terribly exciting, neither was I, because we're not allowed to do all that much. Anyway, we have 3 weeks left in the semester. I just looked that, of course, we have 2 classes per week. I just checked and found that one of these classes coincides with the bank holiday Monday, which means that we have 5 classes left to, well, for me to record, for you to watch and follow. That's very convenient. That's not bad at all, because as you know, my plan has been to spend the second semester simply reading Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, not to try to read any other works, especially since we are, well, under circumstances where perhaps one shouldn't, well, push too much material on students, really. So there are 5 chapters, or sections, I should perhaps say, left to read, and 5 classes. So I'm going to give you 1 lecture per section over the next 3 weeks, and that should complete our class in a way that, well, from my point of view, is not too bad, really. I hope you're also enjoying it a little bit, despite the, well, less than ideal circumstances. Though I have to say for myself, I'm beginning to enjoy experimenting with these, with the online format. So obviously I've recorded a few online lectures. Also this weekend I'm actually a secondary school student in Dublin recorded a podcast with me, asking me lots of questions about philosophy and religion and stuff. He started this series of podcasts, I think, because he got bored. And so now he's interviewed a boxer, a mixed martial art fighter, and a philosophy professor. Interesting combination, at any rate. Something else, I just posted a message under lecture announcements that I would like you to have a look at. It concerns your second essays. The due date is May 15th. I think you already know that. We have in the philosophy department, other departments I think have done the same, staggered the essays for our third-year students, also for the second-year students, but that doesn't concern you. Staggered them in such a way that no essay, not more than 1 essay, will come due per week. Okay. Second point that we actually have to talk about, so that I'm asking for your feedback in this lecture announcement, on a twofold question. The first is, I would again like to have your feedback on topics, rather than simply coming up with my own topics and giving these to you. I always prefer it if students give me ideas for topics that they find interesting. It's much better if students write about topics that they find interesting, rather than writing about topics that I perhaps found interesting 10 years ago when I first taught this class, right? So, secondly, what was the second point? Let me try to remember. Oh, the not so much the due date, the date when the topics will become official or when I'll post them on Moodle. We could do this at the end of the class, when you will have had an opportunity to watch all the lectures, which would be May 8th. Disadvantage, so the advantage would be you would have an opportunity to see all the lectures. Disadvantage, you would only have 1 week for the essays, May 8th until May 15th. But perhaps that's not too serious of a disadvantage. At any rate, that's for you to judge. The other possibility is that I post the topics earlier, but then of course, well, you would have to come up with topics, think about topics, and perhaps even start thinking about your essays before you have had an opportunity to see all the lectures. So you see, each of these has advantages and disadvantages. Give me your feedback, and if there is a clear sense that most of you want this or the other thing, I'll go with what the majority is asking me to do. All right. So now, to today's Foucault lecture. We're reading, of course, obvious which book we're reading, this one. At least this is what my edition looks like. I think the newer edition that most of you will have now has a spiral on here because of the spirals of power and pleasure. But this is an older edition with a different design. At any rate, so today we're going to read, let me try to find the table of contents here, Part 4, Chapter 1. Part 4 has a brief introduction of a couple of pages that I'm going to try to explain for you, and then we're going to get into Chapter 1, Objective, which is a little bit longer, about 11 pages. So all in all, today we're going to cover pages 77 to 91. All right, and I'll begin. So I'm now on page 77. I'm going to try to explain for you and summarize for you the introduction to part 4. As I said, 77 to 80. All right. These pages are transitional. They establish the bridge between what we already read and a discussion in the next few chapters that's going to be of a methodological nature, A, and B, that now focuses much more explicitly and centrally on the question of power, shifting from the topic of sexuality to the topic of power, although, I think you already know this, you realize this, they are connected. This is a book on the history of sexuality, but it uses sexuality as a way to come to an understanding of the way in which power works in contemporary society. So, while the first, 70 pages of the book have been devoted mostly to sexuality with some allusions to power, the next few chapters, those that appear in part 4, focus more on the question of power, with sexuality a little bit more in the background. They're still there, but a little bit more in the background. So, in these first few pages, in which Foucault introduces part 4, he transitions to this methodological part, to this part that focuses a little bit more on power, offering a quick summary of the main results of the preceding chapters of the book, but then also indicating the direction in which he wants to go. So, first, quick summary of what he's covered so far in the book from his own point of view, in his own words, I should perhaps say. As you know, I'm a great admirer of how well Foucault writes. I mean, it's fun to see a philosopher who writes well, as there are so many who don't. I mean, look at the great and wonderful and brilliant Immanuel Kant. Wonderful philosopher. He couldn't write at all. It's so boring. Foucault is a brilliant thinker, perhaps not quite at the level of Kant, but is a brilliant thinker, but he can write also. That's a huge advantage because it makes it much more fun to read. So, at any rate, so on page 78, he writes, what does he write actually there? Here. 78, a few lines from the top of the page, just to summarize what he's been doing so far in the book. In the space of a few centuries, a certain inclination has led us to direct the question of what we are to sex. Sure, so that's what he's been arguing. So since the 17th, sometimes the 18th century, we have become obsessively interested in this question of sexuality, and not just in a general way, but in order to define who we are, find out who we are. Okay? Towards the bottom of this paragraph, from which I just read the first sentence to you, again he has a very pithy formulation of what he wants to argue: sex, the explanation for everything. So that's what sex has become, according to him. Again, I mean, always ask yourself, is this actually true? I think it certainly has truth in it. Is it the truth? Another question. But it certainly has truth in it. Is it not the case, I would ask, with Foucault in contemporary society, that the whole question of what we like and dislike and how we define ourselves in sexual terms has become a kind of core to defining who we are as people? And that's even in Ireland, where race is not such a huge issue. As you know, before I moved back to Ireland, I taught in the United States for 20 years, where race is a huge issue because the society there is much more, well, ethnically diverse. So in the United States, there's not just the question of sexuality, there's always also the question of race, which defines you. So who am I? In the United States, you would say, probably first and foremost, you would say, where do you belong racially? Am I white? Am I black? Am I Asian? Am I Latino? Etc. Or a mix of one of these. Okay? And then the second question would immediately be, which is interesting, because, see, what is race ultimately? Shape of eyes and color of skin. Why should it be that important to understanding who one is? Same with sexuality, really. I mean, sure, it's a part of human life. I mean, we are sexed beings, but this idea that in order to really know who I am, I have to tell myself and then also let everyone else know my really sexual preferences. Foucault wants to say that's recent. Okay. It has given rise to now a slightly more technical point, which also perhaps somewhat goes beyond what he said so far. I'll make this technical point on the basis of a quotation from page 77, center of the page. As if it were essential for us to be able to draw from that little piece of ourselves, sex, not only pleasure but knowledge of who we are, and a whole subtle interchange from one to the other, a knowledge of pleasure, of the kind of pleasures we prefer, a pleasure that comes of knowing pleasure. So you remember that from the previous section. He's arguing that it's not just that we get pleasure from pleasure, but also pleasure from talking about pleasure, talking about sex. And then so he summarizes a knowledge pleasure. And if that fantastic animal we accommodate had itself such finely tuned ears, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'll skip over that. Between each of us and our sex, the West has placed a never-ending demand for truth. It is up to us to extract the truth of sex, since this truth is beyond its grasp. It is up to sex to tell us our truth, since sex is what holds it in darkness. I've tried, let me see if I can show this to you in my notes that I made for today's class. I've tried to summarize what Foucault says there. Can you see it there? In this diagram. So he says, this diagram which is circular, the stick man or woman is obviously us, and on the other side you have sex. So we try to find out what sex exactly is, what sexuality is, and that sexuality in turn defines us. Foucault, in another work of his, called The Order of Things in English translation, argues that this circularity is the central problem of modern philosophy since Kant. Because you see the circle. We ask, what is sexuality? But that sexuality in turn defines us. So you're obviously in a circle there. Foucault calls this circle the empirico-transcendental doublet. Well, shouldn't actually, I'm saying it as though it were this, what's the word, impossible, mysterious secret, but you're students of philosophy, you're also students of Kant, so it shouldn't be that mysterious, really. So Foucault argues in The Order of Things, and this here is an allusion, Foucault argues that the big problem of modern philosophy is that we as human beings, on the one hand, see ourselves as transcendental. Meaning? What does it mean, really, transcendental? That is to say, we constitute the world through the conditions of possibility that really are in the structures of our mind, these famous a prioris, right? On the other hand, in modernity, we've invented the human sciences, psychology, sociology, economics, etc., which analyze us. So what are we actually? Then this raises a question, paradoxical. The question is, what are we? Are we these subjects who dominate everything? I mean, first of all, epistemologically, by the way in which we know, but then also perhaps in more practical terms. Or are we those people who are constituted by all these factors in ourselves and in our environment, by the social conditions which sociology studies, by the economic conditions which economics studies, by the makeup of our minds which psychology and perhaps psychoanalysis study, etc., etc. So the empirico-transcendental subject with the same structure occurs here, according to Foucault, if he is right, in relation to sexuality. We want sexuality to be the key of our personality, but then at the same time, we are the ones investigating what sexuality is. Okay, all right. Let's see. Looking at my notes here. Well, in the final 2 pages of this introductory section, I'm on pages 79 and 80 now. Foucault makes the transition to the next few chapters, in formulating what he really wants to, the question that he wants to ask and how he wants to approach it. On page 79, he writes, just a few lines from the bottom of the page, we must write the history of this will to truth. We must write the history of this will to truth, through analysis and discussion of sexuality. Instead of simply saying, well, that's how it is. You know, we are centrally and essentially sexual beings and blah, blah, blah. Well, Foucault's method is a method of, Nietzsche would say, genealogy, perhaps, of tracing the genealogy, the origins of where this comes from. Why would we have such an idea? Where does it come from? And so, but in order to write the history of this will to truth, we have to have a method. And the method is what he is going to explain in the next few chapters, 4 chapters. Chapter 1, objective of these investigations. Chapter 2, method. Well, I don't have to explain what method is. Chapter 3, domain. Well, what's the area that we're actually studying? Chapter 4, periodization. What are the major periods? So, for today, we're going to look at chapter 1, objective. I gave myself a little break there. So what is the objective of this study, or of this series of studies? Because the history of sexuality has 4 volumes, or 3. Why am I saying or 3? Well, 3 of these volumes were published during Foucault's lifetime, and the 4th volume appeared, I think, just last year or the year before last. I think I mentioned this before to you. Foucault didn't want the 4th volume to be published because he didn't want stuff published that he wasn't able to complete and to give the final shape, so he forbade the publication of anything posthumous after his death. And then his literary executors stuck to that for a while, and then just the temptation of publishing these materials became too great, and everything that Foucault didn't want published was published. Whatever one thinks about that, that is to say. I mean, obviously Foucault's wishes were disrespected, but we have an interesting 4th volume of the history of sexuality. Chapter 1, objective. The objective is to find out, through these studies, what power is. What this chapter does is describe the traditional conception of power which Foucault himself wants to challenge. So most of this chapter, objective, is spent describing the major trends of a traditional conception of power which Foucault himself wants to challenge, subvert, replace by something else. And there are only a couple of hints in these pages of what his own conception is. He's going to discuss that in much more detail in later parts of the book. Okay? He begins, so the objective is finding out what power is. He begins, and again that's something he likes to do, with something like a self-objection, objection to himself, which you can see mostly on page 82. But he writes in an obstinately confused way, so it's an interesting literary device, isn't it? He accuses himself of confusion. But in an obstinately confused way, I sometimes spoke as though I were dealing with equivalent notions of repression and sometimes of law, of prohibition or censorship. So it is most of the central term in the first part of the book was the term repression, because Foucault wants to challenge the repressive hypothesis, and so we came across the term repression quite a bit. But he also occasionally invoked law, suggesting that perhaps the two are the same. If we are repressed, well, what is it that represses us? Law. And here in this paragraph, of which I just read the first sentence to you, Foucault takes up an argument that one could make against him. The argument is, well, look, repression and law are not quite the same. They may be connected, but they are not quite the same, because law is a more sophisticated notion. See, if I say repression, I'm repressed, or I'm repressing people, or whatever, I'm suggesting a simply negative action. I'm preventing you, I'm preventing the people I'm repressing from doing things that they want to do, or perhaps to which they're even entitled. Okay? Law is more subtle. Perhaps I'm using law to repress, but there's something interesting about law. Law, while clearly being, limiting the scope of one's action, also causes action. I'll give you a twofold explanation of this. The first explanation is not what Foucault has in mind, but, that's too bad then. The second explanation is what he... The first one is the story of the fall in Genesis. Adam and Eve... why do Adam and Eve so desire that stupid piece of fruit from a tree? Which is kind of insignificant. They're in paradise, they have everything. But it's only because God says, you may do anything here in paradise, you're extremely welcome, but just don't be touching that one tree with its fruit. And so this law instead of repressing Adam and Eve's desire, wish to transgress, causes it. That is how law works, actually. Augustine discusses that in the Confessions, and one could give many other examples of it. So law is interesting. Therefore, this is what Foucault actually has in mind. He doesn't have the Genesis story of the fall in mind. What Foucault actually has in mind is modern psychoanalysis, where authors like Freud, but also Lacan, Jacques Lacan, say that desire in a not necessarily immediately sexual, but in a kind of psychological sense, comes from law. And then in particular in the psychoanalytic setting, what is it that constitutes the little kid, the infant, as a being that has desires? Well, according to Freud and to Lacan, it's the fact that there's a father who says, don't be doing this stuff. So the law is not simply something that represses or oppresses, but gives rise to stuff, gives rise to desires that without the law wouldn't have existed. So the objection here is, Foucault, you're forgetting that the law is more sophisticated than the notion of law, is more sophisticated than the notion of power. To which Foucault replies, right, I understand this, but I think that even the notion of law falls short of properly capturing the way in which power works now. But now, emphasis on now, because he doesn't want to say that power never worked in this more oppressive, top-down way. He just wants to say that this is how it no longer works in modern and contemporary society. Okay. What is this conception of power which Foucault says is no longer adequate? Well, he tries to summarize this, or doesn't just try, he actually does it, on pages 83 to 85, in a number of paragraphs that begin with key notions or phrases in italics. First, characteristic of the conception of power that he wishes to refute is the negative relation. Negative relation means all that power is, or not all that power is, centrally what power is the ability to say no. What is power? No, don't be doing this. No, don't be doing the other thing. Of course, that's how traditionally power is conceived. The insistence of the rule, by the way, some of these are very closely connected. The insistence of the rule is the second point here. What is power? Well, it exercises its functions through the establishment of rules. Rule is what is central. Power acts, he writes, by laying down the rule. Well, okay, same thing that I just said. The cycle of prohibition, as you can see, again, very, 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 very similar. Power works through series of connected prohibitions. Thou shalt not go near, thou shalt not touch, thou shalt not consume, thou shalt not experience pleasure, thou shalt not speak about it, thou shalt not show thyself, etc. Okay? And these three, well, actually very, very close. Logic of censorship, which is the next point, is not a little bit different, it's actually quite different, adds a significant new dimension here. He says that censorship has three aspects to it. And if you just think about censorship in contemporary societies, I think what he's saying is right. He says there are three aspects. One is censorship. What is censorship? A, affirming that something is not permitted. B, preventing this from being said. And 3, denying that it even exists. What Foucault notes here is that these three aspects of censorship contradict each other. So, for example, if I say, don't be doing X, that's not the same as saying X doesn't even exist, because if people are doing X and I have to prohibit X, that means X is occurring. Likewise, if I tell people, well, don't be talking about X, well, that means they're talking about X, and X exists. So for me to say X doesn't even exist is funny. It's self-contradictory. But if you think about it, that is actually how censorship works. Think of just an oppressive country. Look, one example, I hope not to be overly political here, the way China dealt with the coronavirus. There was this doctor who for many Chinese is a kind of hero. Unfortunately, I don't know his name because, I don't know Chinese. But you remember how this doctor warned very early on of the existence of coronavirus and appeared, I think, in a video podcast that he made with his face mask. And then he died a few weeks later because he himself caught the coronavirus. The initial reaction was to silence the doctor, to tell him, you're not allowed to be saying this, and to deny that the coronavirus even existed. Okay? So you can see how these strategies go hand in hand. And then it turned out, well, it couldn't be denied anymore. It does actually exist. The censorship, well, wasn't effective or didn't work. Why? Because the virus was too strong, I guess. It couldn't be denied. Okay. Next point, 84. The uniformity of the apparatus. Well, he has a way of sometimes putting things in a very complicated way. He wants to say power works homogeneously, works the same way in different areas and also at different levels. So whether I'm the king who exercises power, or I'm the father over his people, or I'm the father who exercises power over his family, or in my case, I'm the teacher exercising power over his class, or whatever, XXX, etc., etc., etc. In each case, power works the same way. Now again, that's what Foucault wants to challenge. He says that's traditionally how power is conceived. It's conceived, you can already see, in a very, Foucault impoverished way, in a one-dimensional way, in a way that doesn't capture many facets of power, but perhaps one facet. He summarizes this conception of power that he wants to challenge in a funny way. 85. It is a power, according to this the traditional conception, that only has the force of the negative on its side. A power to say no, in no condition to produce, capable only of posting limits. It is basically anti-energy, he writes. So is that really true, he wants to ask. This is the paradox of its effectiveness. It is incapable of doing anything except to render what it dominates incapable of doing anything either. Obviously, he wants to make fun at this traditional conception. Just look at this sentence again. The paradox of its effectiveness, it is incapable of doing anything. But his power just, no, not doing anything, except to render what it dominates incapable of doing anything either. No, don't be doing this, so the person is not doing it. And Foucault, in this ironic mode here, wants to question, is that really what power is, this anti-energy, or is there, in fact, more to it? In the next few pages, he offers a twofold explanation of why this conception of power, which he believes to be insufficient, has actually been so successful and continues to be successful. So as I said, his explanation is twofold. The first part of the explanation occurs described on page 86. It's an interesting explanation. Let me offer a general and tactical reason that seems self-evident. Power is tolerable only on condition that it mask a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. Interesting. So, power is tolerable only on condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. If I say, power really is the ability to say no. It's to establish boundaries. It's to prevent people from stepping across these boundaries and acting beyond them. I think that makes power seem straightforward and relatively harmless and easy to identify. So I'm exercising power when I tell you don't be doing X. Okay? But what if power actually worked in much more sophisticated ways, in ways that didn't just define external boundaries to our conduct, but if power perhaps shaped our conduct from the inside? See, that would be a much more threatening form of power. Foucault's, obviously it's just one paragraph, so his hypothesis that he throws out here is that power likes to hide itself, to mask itself, to present itself as this more straightforward, kind of crude form, so that we don't see the very sophisticated form in which power actually shapes us from inside, in which power doesn't just prevent us from doing X, but shapes us in such a way that we do Y. So, perhaps you can already see the direction in which this is going. I mean, if you look at our contemporary societies, Ireland, other, certainly societies in the Western world, how do governments, institutions of authority, etc., how do they exercise their power? Well, usually by shaping our behavior from the inside rather than defining external boundaries. So all this is up for discussion. See, for example, how is the Irish government dealing with the coronavirus crisis? What kind of power is it exerting? Is it more power which does tell us this Easter weekend you're not allowed to go to your holiday homes, otherwise the guards are going to stop you and potentially arrest you. That's the old-fashioned type of power, isn't it? On the other hand, this kind of shaping people from the inside, is that perhaps also what's happening right now? Is it perhaps the case that this coronavirus crisis is instilling in us patterns of behavior that we're going to continue to have in the future? So, for example, in the future, are we all going to be more distant from each other? Are we all going to be more aware of the fact that each of us could be just a bundle of viruses from which we have to protect ourselves? So that would be the second type of power. So that, for example, even after the end of the coronavirus crisis, when no guards will be in the street to prevent anyone from going to, their holiday homes on the Dingle Peninsula, perhaps people will still continue to act in certain ways that have been according to which they have been shaped. So there you can see these two types of power. Okay. Well, I'll just repeat because I so much enjoy reading Foucault to you. I'll read one of his sentences to you here on page 86. Power as a pure limit set on freedom is, at least in our society, the general form of its acceptability. Okay. Oh, that's only the first part of his argument. So why is this traditional conception of power, which according to him is no longer adequate, why does it continue to find support? First argument I gave you, the first aspect of the argument I gave you. The second argument is for historical reasons, because historically speaking, this is, since the Middle Ages, he says, how power used to be exercised in monarchical governments in the Western world. By the way, why am I saying the Western world? Because Foucault himself he doesn't want to say in the world, worldwide. Because already if we say in the Western world, we're making huge claims. If we say power was always exercised in every part of the world in such and such a way, well, that's not really a claim anyone would be capable of defending. You would have to be a historian of India, of China, of Africa, of tribes of aborigines in Australia, etc. No one is that. No one has that abilities. Therefore, it's better to limit oneself a little bit in one's claims. So, in Western societies, 87, towards the center, end of the first paragraph. In Western societies since the Middle Ages, the exercise of power has always been formulated in terms of law, namely in terms of a law formulated by a king or queen, in some cases queen, imposing structure and order on his or her realm. Okay? In particular because the political world in the Middle Ages and early modernity used to be more, what's the word, perhaps confused and complex than now. Look, for example, at the history of Germany, which until 1871 consisted of a multiplicity of states with the individual counts and kings of smaller states, etc. And so then the king was someone, in particular then later in Germany, the emperor from 1871, was the one who unified all this, who brought a general law to bear on his entire realm in order to, impose order, unify, homogenize. So therefore, our understanding of power stemming from this period is that power is exercised by law in order to impose order and render the conduct of people more homogeneous by imposing kind of general structures. Okay? So that's his historical explanation. But Foucault will say this. We no longer live in monarchies. I mean, even, let's say, the British who live in a monarchy, well, look, they do and they don't. The Queen has no power. but that would get us into a discussion of British politics. But the Queen is not the way a British king was 200 or 300 years ago actually having power. So in France, of course, you know, the monarchy ended kind of spectacularly with the French Revolution, although then, as you know from your history lessons, it came back for about 100 years, but it ended spectacularly by the decapitation of Louis XIV. Foucault summarizes the way in which our conception of power has failed to keep up with the way in which our type of government has changed. He summarizes this in the following sentence on the bottom of page 88. At bottom, despite the differences in epochs and objectives, the representation of power has remained under the spell of monarchy. We still conceive of power as though we were ruled by a traditional monarch. In political thought and analysis, we still have not cut off the head of the king. Allusion, obviously, to the French Revolution. In political thought and analysis, we still have not cut off the head of the king. We speak about power as though we were still under the rule of a king who imposes power on his realm by making laws. But that's no longer how power works. Well, how does power work? Well, he doesn't really get into it so much in this chapter. He hints a little bit at it. But it remains, it's not a criticism of Foucault, though. He offers much greater detail later on. In this chapter, he offers a couple of hints at his more positive conception of power on page 89. If it is true that the juridical system, with its emphasis on law, was useful for representing an older type of power, actually makes an interesting point here, shall I comment on it? He says the older form of power was the one power of saying no, found its, paradigmatic, strongest expression in the power to impose death. So it's a power to, well, it's almost, it's a bit morbid. It's the power to cut short. It's the power to prevent, and ultimately to prevent people from doing something by threatening death. So that's the older type of power. This conception is no longer able to capture the way power is now exercised, because it is utterly incongruous, he says, with the new methods of power, whose operation is not ensured by right, the right of the king to do such and such a thing, but by technique. Power is not simply asserting a right, but deploying techniques. Now, what exactly does that mean? He'll get into that. Not by law, but by normalization. That's the first time that this term occurs in this book, which is going to be central in the following chapters. Not by law, but normalization. How does power work these days? Not by law. You're not allowed to do this, no, not allowed to do the other thing, but rather by normalizing people's conduct. By in very subtle ways, shaping people in an inward way through norms. Okay? And not by punishment, but by control. Again, if you look at the way in which modern governments work in Western democracies, punishment is relatively rare. So decapitation in public, or quartering people in the marketplace, medieval practices, that was drastic punishment, but rather control, surveillance. Look, for example, at one of the reactions to the coronavirus crisis, surveillance. Having us install apps on our phones that will make it possible to track those who may have infected us or whom we may in turn be infecting. So not by punishing people, though you see guards on the streets Easter, the punishment was threatened, which also means that this older form of power is not completely dead yet, but it's perhaps being superseded largely by a more subtle form of power which exercises control. Okay. Not punishing children for looking at unsuitable content on the internet, but installing a filter which controls what they can watch on the internet, for example. Okay. Last couple of pages, 90 and 91. Here Foucault once again tries to elucidate the relationship between what he is trying to do in this book in relation to sexuality and in relation to the whole question of power. So as you can see from today's reading and from today's lecture, we're now moving more. I hardly talked about sexuality at all, neither does Foucault. We're moving from a discussion of sexuality to a discussion of power, yet the two are related. I'll repeat it quickly, though I said it at the beginning of this lecture. They're related in this way. The study of sexuality wants to uncover the type of power being used in order to shape us into a particular type of sexual being. So sexuality serves as an example, or perhaps even as a paradigmatic example, of the way in which power works. But this also means that the history of sexuality could also be entitled The History of Power, with perhaps a subtitle, Using Sexuality as an Example. All right. So I think that's it for today. On Friday, I'm going to record a lecture for you on Chapter 2, Method, pages 93 to 102. So if you want to be ahead of me, you can already read these pages. I hope to see you all again virtually on Friday, and hope that the rest of your week goes well. Goodbye for now.